Okay, good morning. I would like to introduce our speaker here today. This is Miss Renata Laxova. She was born in Czechoslovakia and was put on the last Kindertransport out prior to World War II. Her parents had the foresight and the hard decision to choose to send her on the Kindertransport to Manchester, England, where she lived for many years during the war with another family, and then was able to return afterwards and reunite with her family, those who had survived World War II and then lived under communism, and once again had to escape. So she has some fascinating stories to tell you today. So please give her your utmost attention, and we appreciate her coming.
Thank you, Angie, for your introduction, and thank you for inviting me again to come. I came once before, about a year ago. So, I'm going to tell you what happened many, many years ago, and how we, my family and I, and many other children, experienced all that. So the most important message, perhaps, that I would like to give to you is the following. Have you heard of Sir Nicholas Winton? No. All right. Well, I'll tell you about him later, and I didn't really mean to talk about him at the very beginning. I'll tell you afterwards. But Sir Nicholas Winton was basically one person who single-handedly rescued 669 children from the country where I was born, which was in those days Czechoslovakia. Today it's the Czech Republic and Slovakia. So today it's these two countries. And he gave a very famous quotation, which I like to carry with me in my life. And what he said was, well, people asked him later when everybody found out about him and how he had rescued all of us and helped all of us 50 years later, he said, well, if it's not impossible, there has to be a way to do it. So that was his life philosophy. He did an awful lot of very good things just because he was determined and he didn't give up and he was successful. So that perhaps is the message when you're in trouble with school, I don't know, things that you have to do and that you feel are overwhelming. Just wonder, think about, is it really impossible, or is there a way I can do this? Because that's what he did. And Sir Nicholas Winton, after we found out about him, died just a year ago at the age of 106. So maybe doing good things makes you live longer, I don't know. So I will begin from the beginning. I was born in, I can take this, can't I? I was born in what is now the Czech Republic. At the time it was called Czechoslovakia, and I was born in 1931, so you can do your math, it's horrendous, and I wish it wasn't. It's okay, thank you. No, it's fine. If this is all right with you, I'm fine. And I was born into a family, we were Jewish, average middle-class family. I was a happy little girl. I did everything all the other little children did. I loved to ice skate and swim and go to gymnastics. And my mother was home with me. I had a nanny. That was a luxury, but we had a good life. We had lots of friends, and this was, at the time, sort of the middle-class Jewish population of Czechoslovakia, which was a good country. It was freedom-loving. It had just attained its freedom after the end of World War I and become Czechoslovakia with the help of President Woodrow Wilson in this country. And we had a wonderfully democratic president whose name was President Masaryk, and we all loved him. He loved not only freedom, but he loved liberty and all the good things in life, and he really made a huge difference in this country. I think you might know Czechoslovakia is, or the Czech Republic now is, so that's where we were, and it was a happy life. And then slowly, I went to first grade in 1937 when I was 6 years old, just as any other normal child did. And then in 1937 or 8, when I became 7, in second grade, we started hearing about Hitler. We heard him screaming on the radio. He was very terroristic. Oh, it's even there. I think. Now. And that's what I looked like when I was little. That's maybe 4 years old. As you can see, I'm feeding my toy dog and just very contented. I was born in Brno, B-R-N-O, which is the second biggest city in the Czech Republic after Prague, which is the capital. And as you can see, it's just a normal city. This is perhaps a newer picture, but there's nothing different about it, except that some of you may have heard of Mendel. And Mendel did his discovery, the scientist who is the father of genetics, who worked with peas and bees. And Mendel did his work in Brno, so it's well known and world renowned that is where his museum resides now. And this happened in March of 1939. Before that, there were many events that were very worrisome to the population of not only Czechoslovakia, but the surrounding smaller countries, Hungary, Poland, Romania, and others. Central Europe was in trouble. Germany had lost the war, had lost World War I, and was paying enormous amounts of money, reparations, to make up for what they had caused during the war. So they had very little money for their population. There was unemployment, there was no building, there was nowhere for people to live. They had no jobs whatsoever. They had huge, their money had no value, so I usually like to say that they sometimes carried, to go to buy a loaf of bread, they had to carry their paper money in a huge bag because it had no value. So Germany was in trouble. And in 1933, a new chancellor of Germany, basically a leading politician, was elected or appointed, and his name was Adolf Hitler. And he had already written a book called Mein Kampf. Kampf means fight, my strife. And had people read that book very carefully, which they didn't, mostly they ignored it, they would have known some of Hitler's future purposes. But not many people, most people ignored it. And so Hitler came to power as the Chancellor of Germany, and he began to terrorize the population. And he said he would, however, he would find jobs, he would refurbish the factories, he would find money, he would have people building and able to live in civilized houses. Basically, he was going to unite Germany, which it wasn't at the time. It was several little different units. And so people started to admire and listen to him. And he was, I don't know if you've ever heard a recording of Hitler's voice. He screamed into the radio. He talked to thousands, if not millions of people. And he had them all in hysterics, raising their hands and screaming, Sieg Heil, Sieg Heil. And if you imagine 1 million people saying that all at once, it's pretty powerful. They thought he was going to save the world. He was also going to invade other countries. He never used the word invade. He was going to get rid of and destroy populations that were not comfortable to him, who were not interested in his politics and in his rebuilding of the German Reich. By then he was calling it an empire. So those people who were uncomfortable to him, he was going to destroy or annihilate, or at least he was going to send them away, expel them from his country. And the number one people who were uncomfortable to him were the Jews, as well as Roma or gypsies, people who were handicapped, people who were physically disabled, all sorts of groups of people who were uncomfortable and different from what Hitler's ideal of a human being was, which was tall, blonde, blue-eyed, handsome, and of the Nordic race. There's one sort of difference always in my thinking about this. Although he talked about his ideal Nordic race, he still invaded some of the Scandinavian countries who looked exactly to the image of his model as he described it. So basically, he was a terrorist. He was a psychopath, and he started. There he is. You can see his face, his hands. And so he started making these kinds of noises, and people in the rest of the world either didn't believe him, or if they did believe him, they thought, well, he's there way somewhere in a country in countries that we don't really know. Here in America, we're happy, we're safe. Although it was after the Depression had also affected Europe, of course. You remember in history the Great Depression in the 1929, 30s. The same thing happened in Europe. So everybody was unhappy, and here comes this man who says, I'm going to save you all, as long as you can be part of my ideal population and my ideal image of a 10-year empire. That's what he talked about. An empire, 1,000-year empire. That's what he talked about. It was going to last forever, and this empire was going to contain all the countries in Europe and maybe in the world. I'm not quite sure of all of his purposes and intentions, but anyway, that's what he said. And he wanted the Jews out of the country, so out of Germany, and Jews were playing a huge role. They were intellectuals, they were in business, they had money, and they were very helpful in government and etc. And so he wanted them out. And there was a big group of Jews who initially were of Polish origin. So he got them all together, he made it compulsory, and wanted them to send them back to Poland. And so there was, I don't know how many of them there were, but thousands in some very unpleasant camps on the border between Germany and Poland. And among those was a family of, I think, 3 or 4 people, parents, and some young children who were having a very hard time. It was cold, it was wet, they had nothing to eat, they were neglected, they had nowhere to sleep. And so they wrote a letter by chance to their brother, the child of the family, of the parents, who happened to be in France, in Paris, describing their terrible situation in these camps. The Poles didn't want them, the Germans were kicking them out. There was nowhere for these thousands of people to go. So they wrote to their son, and he was so angry and so upset that he got a gun, or had a gun, I don't know. He went in Paris to the German embassy and shot an official there whom he happened to encounter. Shot him, and 2 days later this man died. His name was Fomrath, V-O-M-R-A-T-H, but you don't have to remember that. So Mr. Fomrath died, and Hitler took that as an excuse that the Jews had destroyed the the German embassy in France, in Paris, and they, of course, executed the young man. But that was the beginning of Hitler's physical, visible revenge. And he ordered his police, the Gestapo and many others, the secret police, to destroy as many Jews and as many businesses, as many houses, as many buildings, synagogues as they could. So, and they were to set fire to many of these important buildings, and not the fire brigade wasn't allowed to be called. So this all happened on November 9th, and it might be good to remember that name, on November 9th, 1938. So I was a 7-year-old little girl in 2nd grade, and it happened in Berlin and in Vienna, in Austria and Germany, not in my country. And this was called because the Gestapo and the police and all the other, the secret police were going around destroying everybody, and they were breaking windows and buildings, and so there was an awful lot of glass around. And this was called, at that time, that night, it was done in the night, secretly. Many, many, many people were killed, many were arrested and tortured, and it was called Kristallnacht. Nacht is night, the night of broken glass. November 9th, 1938. They were going around breaking whatever they could. And so many people were destroyed, and it was terrible. Did not happen in Czechoslovakia yet, but it was very close. We knew about all that. After that night of broken glass, the British Parliament, the only ones, sat down and said, well, what can we do to get rid of this Hitler? Or what can we do to help these little countries that he's completely annihilating? And the British Parliament sat for, I don't know, it is said 48 hours. Maybe somebody brought food in, or they were able to sleep. I have no idea, but apparently it took 48 hours. And they came up with an idea in the British Parliament. And they said, okay, we'll do at least one thing. We'll let in up to 10,000 children into our country, into Britain. So that was the decision. And after that Kristallnacht, in Germany and in Austria, children were beginning to be assembled by parents, by organizations, and taken to Britain. And that was the very first time that the word Kindertransport, children's transport, was ever introduced. So it was after Kristallnacht that the Kindertransports started. This wasn't happening in Czechoslovakia yet, although Hitler had his influence there too. In fact, after Kristallnacht, my father had one Friday evening had been to synagogue, and he brought home to our dinner table a couple, a young couple, alone, father and mother, or husband and wife. And they told us the following story, which I have never forgotten. they were at home. They lived in Vienna, and they had come, I don't know, the day before, 2 days before from Vienna. And they came to our synagogue, and so my father invited them to our dinner table. They told us that on Kristallnacht, a few days before, the Gestapo had broken into their house, broken down the doors, kicked down the doors, and the father, who was in the bathtub, was pulled out of the bathtub. He was only allowed to take one towel, and he was told to kick down the stairs of the house. The mother was already in bed, and they had 2 little children. And so they went into the bedroom, grabbed her, also allowed her to take a bath towel. I don't know what she had, night clothes. And quickly she grabbed her children. There were 2 of them, one by each hand, and they kicked her down the stairs. But while they were kicking them both down the stairs, they shot the 2 children. So that the last vision that this couple, these parents had of their children, was them lying helpless on their stairs of their house in blood. And that's what they told us that night in 1938. I was 7 years old, and I always say, if I were to see them, I never saw them again. In the morning, they were quickly taken away, and I was told later that my father helped them escape from the country altogether. I don't know. I don't know what happened to them. But whenever I talk about this, I always tell everybody that if I were to see them now, this was 1938, so you do the math, how long ago that was, over 70 years ago, I would recognize them, because I've never, ever forgotten their faces and their grief. So that was the beginning. That was great. And by then, after Kristallnacht, I was not allowed to go to my gymnastics. I wasn't allowed to go swimming anymore. We'll talk about this later. I wasn't allowed to go ice skating. Jews were not on the weekends. We weren't allowed to go to certain places in the woods or the fields, wherever we were used to. We were outdoors people. It was all changing very much. And my mother realized that, and in addition to that, there was a conference, which you may have heard of, in Munich, in Bavaria, where this horrendous train wreck just happened 2 days ago. If you heard about it on TV, 2 trains collided head-on. So in that area somewhere, there was a conference. Hitler invited the British, the French, the Italian prime ministers. That was Mussolini, you may have heard that name. And the British one, Neville Chamberlain, and Mr. Neville Chamberlain appeared on Downton Abbey last Sunday evening, by chance, not really, but an actor. And the French one's name was Daladier. And Hitler invited them and said, okay, there's going to be war. I'm going to occupy every European country. Under one condition, you can persuade me not to do that. If you give me part of Czechoslovakia. So they had a conference and they talked, and they didn't invite the Czechs, and they decided, yes, they would give him part of Czechoslovakia. And that was called the Sudetenland, Sudeten, Sudetenland. And it doesn't matter, it's the northwest part, which is next to Germany, and there were lots of German-speaking people there. So they gave this to him and then announced to the Czechs that, well, we've given part of your country, but that the price is there will be no war in Europe or in the world. And everybody believed him. And Mr. Chamberlain came. He was very well known for carrying an umbrella all the time. And he carried his umbrella, and in his other hand he had a piece of paper, and on it was written, "Peace in our time." So peace. Hitler promised peace. Well, this all happened before Kristallnacht, around Kristallnacht, November, September, October, November 1938. In March of 1939, Mr. Hitler, who promised everything, and its brother and mother or whatever, was in Czechoslovakia. He invaded my country. And there's somewhere there. This is a picture of the invasion, a real picture for a document from a book. You can see the tanks, the people around. The Czechs were weeping, the Germans were waving and screaming welcome. And so the whole country was occupied, and we were called the Protectorate. We were being protected by Hitler. So my mother called me to her room that morning, and she said, well, this has happened. You're supposed to go to school. It's a normal day. And she was crying, and I understood because I had seen many of my parents' friends talking about emigration, leaving the country, and my mother believed that this was very, very dangerous. So I did go to school, but we were sent away. And in the end, it turned out that we were not allowed to finish second grade even. Were sent home because we were Jewish. The children who were not Jewish were not willing to play with me anymore, even talk to me on the street, and things started. And as I said, we weren't allowed to go to the public places which we were so used to going to, and in nature or swimming or skating or whatever, gymnastics. So everything changed. And my mother, and Hitler was screaming, I am going to destroy all the Jews. And my mother believed him. Most people didn't, said, well, it'll get a little worse before it gets better, but he can't destroy a whole nation or two nations or three or however many. That he didn't like the Slovaks either. He didn't like anybody who was different from him. So my mother heard a speech by a member of the British Parliament. And this man, whose name was Mr. George Lansbury, talked that Hitler, and said that Hitler meant business, and he was going to kill and annihilate as many people who were uncomfortable to him as he could. My mother believed him, and she sat down and wrote a letter. And the letter was to this gentleman who had given the speech, and she wrote it to him in the British Parliament. He was an MP, a member of Parliament. And he told him, my mother told him, asked him, enclosed a little picture of me and said, we are a small Jewish family. This is our little girl. She's 7 years old. And is there any way you, sir, could help her get into England to safety? And my mother told all her friends about this, and the friend laughed at her and said, goodness, you're never going to get a response. But guess what? 5 days later, my parents received a letter from Mr. Lansbury's, the gentleman whom she had heard, his secretary. And he wrote saying that they would try very hard to get me into England and to safety if they could. So my parents sat down and said, well, thank you very much, and we're going to write a letter saying, no, she's our only child, we're not sending her anywhere. But in the end, it turned out that 5 days later, another letter came, and that came from a family called Daniels, Mr. Harry and Mrs. Edna Daniels, and they were writing from Manchester in England saying, we have found out about your little girl, we have a little boy, we also have a little kitten, and we live in the suburbs of Manchester, and we would be happy to take care of your little girl for as long as it takes. So that then a correspondence between them and my parents began. And I've often wondered how did they do it? How did they made me start learning English, that was fine, I was still at home. How could they decide to send me away? Think about this. If you were younger than you are now, and your parents told you, we're going to send you away to a country where you can't speak the language, where you don't know the people, they're not related, but you'll be safe. And my mother's answer was always, because she knew that this was a matter of life or death. Hitler was already killing people in camps and destroying them, not gassing them quite yet, but that came later. So they decided they would talk and correspond. Maybe by the time I was supposed to leave, nothing would happen. Who knew? Well, we got a date. And the date was July 31st or August 1st, 1939. My 8th birthday was on July 15th that year, so I was 8 years old and 2 weeks. And that was the date that they were to bring me to Prague, to the main station with some luggage, and that would be when I would go. And how did that happen? Well, there was a committee that everybody called, and the letters all came from this committee, and it was called the British Committee for Children from Prague. And that was the name that was given on all the correspondence. And that British committee told us the date, July 31st, bring her with this much luggage, etc., etc. And what was the condition of including a child in this, there would be a transport, the word was used, and what was the condition? There were two. One was that the child had to be between ages 3 and 17, and the other condition was that someone, an institution or a group or a church or a school, had to pay, or the parents, whoever, £50 sterling, a lot of money at the time, for each child so that it would not become a burden of the state. So those were the two conditions, and they're given here. And again, you can see this is all, although copied by Nicholas, respectfully, British Committee for Children, and this was on the 9th of June, 1939. And then they tell you how the child luggage and all these instructions. So it was all happening, and really on July 31st, well, a few days before, my mother took me to Prague. We lived, as I said, in the other big city in the country, or maybe I hadn't. Yes, I did say. We were there for maybe 4 days, and then my father came, and then they took me to the station that night. And suddenly, and I was quite excited. I heard that I was going to have a little brother, whom I didn't have. He was 5 years old. A little kitten. We were going to live somewhere where there was a garden. We lived in an apartment. So it was, you know, they told me about it, and I was learning English, so it was sort of okay. But as we were going from the hotel to the station, that's when it hit me. I realized I was going on my own, without my parents, to an unknown country, with an unknown language, to an unknown family. So I started crying bitterly, begging them, please, 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 don't take me. I will eat my spinach, which was my big thing that I didn't like at home. And I promised, so my mother's, think about that. What would you say to your child? You're old enough maybe to think about this. Here you are sending him or her away into the unknown and trying to convince him or her that it's good for him. Well, again, my mother said, the reason that we're sending you is because we love you very much. As you know, you can't go swimming anymore where we used to. You can't go ice skating. You can't go to gymnastics. You're not even allowed to go to school. One of the things I didn't tell you, one day after the occupation, after Hitler had invaded our country, I saw my Hebrew teacher kneeling on the street, on the sidewalk, cleaning the sidewalk with a toothbrush. and I was devastated. My teacher whom I had seen every week or whatever. So it was bad, and my mother was convinced, as was my father. My grandmothers mostly weren't. They said children belong to their mothers, and therefore she should be here no matter what. But they persevered. And this is a list that this British Committee for Children from Prague, I'm up at the top there by chance. It was in alphabetical order, and there were, this is me, my date of birth, as you can see anyway. And then it says who is paying and where am I going, and there you see the name Daniels, Flixton, Neum, and that was in Lancashire, etc. So every child had to be given, written on, and these lists exist. This is a copy, but the originals exist, and there were truly 669 of us. And so there I was, sitting in the middle of two bigger boys in the train, in the express train at the station in Prague. And my parents were on the platform waving, and only mothers of children under 6 were allowed to go even into the train, into the compartment to say goodbye. I was over 6. My mother snuck in, but then was pulled out by a social worker and told that only young children were allowed to have their mother, as if I hadn't been young. I was 8 and 1 week or something. But anyway, they had to leave, and so we traveled for 2 days in the 8th, it was of all of these, 8th total out of 669, 8th Kindertransport, children's transport, that arrived in London 2 days later safely. There was one more transport that was organized and waiting in Prague at the station with 250 children. And that was sitting there on September 1, 1939. We left in July or August 1, 1939. 1 month later, this train was sitting there at the station and was not allowed to leave. 250 children. Nobody they weren't allowed because war started. Hitler invaded Poland on that day, September 1. And so the British Prime Minister declared war. And that was the beginning of World War II in Europe. And you know when World War II started here in this country? You do. Anybody? Pearl Harbor? Well, anyway, December 7th, 1941. So, but in Europe, World War II started on September 1, 1939. And so the children of that train were sitting there, and if we have a minute, I'll show you in a little while what was done. And not one of them survived the war, and nobody knows what happened to them. So, that was my parents and I before I left. Can you see this? Yes, is it? So that was me, Mommy, Daddy. This was a picture of how I didn't tell you, we had labels around our necks with a number. There's one there, not mine. The few people whom I know from that time, remember their numbers. I have no clue what my number was, but we had to put it on our necks, and we traveled with this thing around our necks for 2 whole days and nights, and we went across the Channel, the British Channel, and we arrived in London. And there, some children were picked up by their families. I was picked up by a friend of my parents with whom it had been arranged, who was already in London. And I was waiting, sitting on my suitcase, 8 years old, and he didn't come. And so I thought I was abandoned in London. I knew the address of my future family in Manchester, but I knew I was in London. So I didn't know what, but he did eventually come. Then he put me on a train. I met my family near Manchester the next day, and I spent 7 good years in England with that family. Their name was Daniels, as I told you, and our daughter, our elder daughter's name is Daniela for them. But here you can see this is a real sort of composite of the children in the transport. Now, I was there for 7 years, and my advantages were 2. One was my age. I was 8. What could they do with me except put me into school? There were many children who were older, and in those days, around the 1940s, in England, all you had to do to go to school was to go till you were 14, compulsorily, and otherwise you could leave. So children who were older, maybe 12 or 13, may not have been sent to school by their host families or by the institution or school or church where they were taken. And so they didn't get the education that I did. I was able to go to normal school and then later very good academically oriented grammar school, it was called in those days, different from grammar school here, like a little something in middle school or whatever. And I did well, and I was there for 7 years total. This is a letter. You can see this was one of the first letters. I hope you can see this. And one of the first letters, it's already in English. And this was newspaper, letter paper that my mother, writing paper that my mother gave me, put in my luggage. And how nicely I wrote at the end of 2nd grade. This is all at that time, this was, the very beginning. And here we are, if you can see us in our school uniform, that was me. And this is my little brother, who was 2.5 years younger. And a week from now, he's going to be, 82 or something. But then that was my little brother, and we were happy together, and it was a good 7 years. This is interesting. This is called, how did we correspond? Everybody asks me how we corresponded. Initially, we could write letters. But then, after the war started, we couldn't. And Hitler gradually occupied one country in Europe after another. And so all we could write was these 25 words. Oops. I'm almost done. 25-word lettergrams, they were called, organizing or published by the Red Cross, the International Red Cross. They did an incredible job. So you could get that form, and you could write 25 words. I am well, this is where I live now, and this is what's happening. And then it would, with an address, and then it would go to the recipient. This is the other side of this. This is the back or the front, whatever, front. This whole is one document. It would go to them and then come back again to you, and that's how there was some kind of communication between the children and their parents. But this didn't last very long. And these were called Red Cross lettergrams. And one day my parents were in their home yet, in my hometown, living with 5 other families. Eventually, every city had a sort of a ghetto, not like the Warsaw Ghetto, but a sort of ghetto where only Jews were allowed to live. And they were allowed to have 1 family per room, or 1 room per family. So in our house where we lived, or apartment, we had 5 other families. There were 6 families, including my parents, with children, and then eventually they were all taken out of there and put into transports. Nobody survived except my parents. And the reason they survived was that all those who went to Auschwitz and all the other concentration camps organized by Hitler in the cattle wagons, as you may have heard, perished because they had a child maybe whom they were holding by the hand, and Dr. Mengele, so-called doctor, who sat at the head of lines going through Auschwitz with his thumb, and he would show this way to the gas chambers and that way to work. Well, you never went to work if you had a child, so you went straight to the gas chambers. So when I came home 7 years later, there was no one my age, no one, and very few people my parents' age. And if there was anybody my parents' age, they were single. They'd lost their spouses who had had the children to take care of. Well, one day they arrested my parents and to the Gestapo, and the Gestapo was screaming, holding these letters, saying, "What is this?" And we know you're members of a spy ring, and we want to know, we know all your phrases, "we are well" and "we have moved." The only phrase we don't know or expression is, "what is Renata?" So my parents said, well, Renata is our daughter, and she left here officially. The Gestapo knew about this. She went in July to England. Well, they didn't believe that, so they were arrested. And in a way, that was their saving, because they were sent to Slovakia, where my father was, he was a Slovakian citizen, and so there they were able to hide. My mother then had somebody else, she became a different person. This is someone who transmitted this. These lettergrams went from country to country. One even came through the United States. Wherever the country wasn't occupied, you could get these letters and send them on to their destination. So this was someone from Denmark, I think, Mr. Hakbar Jonassen, who wrote to my parents saying he just recently had received a letter, whatever, and he was sending it. So my mother became a different person, somebody completely not her. She got a birth certificate, other things, birth certificates for some parents, etc., different name, and became a non-Jewish nanny. And she worked in this castle here. You can see the mountains behind a little bit, I think. Old castle with lots of people. Nobody knew who she was. And she took care of this little boy whose name was Peter. And that was my mom pretending to be a single nanny, no family, no anybody. And eventually some Russian and German battles occurred around there. So she had to quickly escape, found herself walking up the mountain, trying to find shelter in the mountains, and she had quite a difficult time, but for a year or two she took care of this little boy. He was safe, but nobody, she was Miss Susanna. Her name was Nellie, first name, and second name, my name, but no, she was somebody else. My father went to a, we don't need that, went to a work detail in the mountains that you saw there, the Tatra Mountains. They're a little bit like the Alps. And there were 40 of them. And every day they would travel up the mountain in a little train. The Germans were making them, screaming at them and making them work on the railroad. And one day they were going up the mountain, and there were 40 of them, as I said, and somebody was screaming, "Every Jew out." So my father thought, well, that doesn't sound very good. And he didn't go out of the train. All the others did. And they were all shot on the platform in front of his eyes. He went and hid in the toilet of the little local train. And then he walked up and down the mountain, as did my mother, at a different time. So that was how they saved their lives, each one of them separately. Eventually, when the war ended, they were able to meet, and then my mother came to England, and we were the only intact family, my parents and I, I think of the 669 children, tell you some numbers, and then I'll tell you about Mr. Winton. 669, there were 20 after the war, about, who had one parent, and 5 who had both parents. I was 1 out of 5 of 669 who after the war had both parents. So I came home, I couldn't speak my own languages. I could speak German and Czech before. I couldn't speak a word, I'd forgotten everything. I could speak English. So in the 80s, 1980s, it was found out that, I'll show you, that this British Committee for Children had been formed by a man whose name was Mr. Nicholas Winton. He was 29 years old. He was working in London and was going on a skiing holiday at Christmas in 1938, I think, after this Munich conference that I told you about, after Kristallnacht, and he was going skiing somewhere in the Alps. And a friend wrote to him and said, you know, let's not go skiing, come here. There's a lot of interest here for you. And he came to Prague, and he started looking at the situation. Hitler had thrown out people from the Sudetenland. I told you those who were German-speaking, if they didn't want to go into Germany, they were running. There was chaos just before the war, so they really wanted people to help. And so adults were being helped, like politicians, scientists, artists, musicians, important people were being helped to get out of the country. Not many, but a few. And Mr. Winton said, well, yeah, but who's helping the children? So he sat down and started writing lists. Who might like to send a child? He spoke to the Gestapo, he spoke to his own Home Office, which is like the Secretary of State here, and that way he organized these 8 transports with the railroads and with everybody else, and got the 669 of us out. There's a film which you could easily see and borrow, DVD. It's called Nicky's Family, and that's what it's about. It's how he did it in a hotel, sitting behind a table like this, talking to parents. Okay, do you have the 50 pounds, or does somebody, what's his name, where's he going? And so he made those lists that I showed you. So that was Mr. Winton. But we didn't know that for 50 years. In the 80s, suddenly after the war, I told you, remember what I told you about his last train? Yes? That it was sitting in Prague and not allowed to move. That bothered him a great deal. But then the war came. And so people who have asked him since, he said, well, I couldn't do any more for the children of Czechoslovakia, so he joined the RAF and did all sorts of good things during World War II. But that was something he didn't think about. So the book, scrapbook with the lists that I showed you, was in his attic. And his wife one day in 1988, I think, was going through the attic and found it. And she said, what's this? I said, oh, it's something I did a long time ago, and he was sort of dismissing it. It had to be done, another of his phrases. I only did what had to be done. And so they got some of the children together that were on those lists. And they had a TV show where somebody was interviewing him. And he was sitting in the front row like this, and they had invited the many children, adults by then, 50 years ago, 50 years later, not quite, almost 50 years, it was 50 years later, exactly actually, sitting in the rows like this. And that TV scene is one of the most dramatic in TV history, and those who've seen it say that, agree with that. So he was sitting in the front row, and all these children, quote unquote, whom they were able to get are sitting behind him, but he doesn't know that. He doesn't know a single one of them. And so the interviewer says, well, Mr. Winton, you know, tell us what you did in the 30s, and he talks a little bit, and then they say, well, and how many children, or what do you know about them? And he doesn't know anything. So the interviewer stands here and says, if there's anybody in this room who thinks that Mr. Winton might have saved their life, please get up. And they all get up, because they're all the children that he had saved, and they'd got them together. That's an amazing scene on TV. So it's worth seeing. So now, just before the end, because I think with this, we're done. This is just this is in German, the 2 conditions that were needed for children. This is the list. My parents, the transport, a letter, the Red Cross lettergram, so-called, and I wanted them my mother's hiding place, and that's it. These were my foster parents, my father, foster mom, after the war, and that's Prague as it is now. Later, the communists came in 1948, took over. They were almost as bad as the Nazis, not quite, but I won't tell you about that now. If you could put in the other one, I just want to show you. In 2009, Mr. Winton was 100 years old, and they organized a train that was going to be a replica. They made 4 steam trains, really built them. One was Czech-Hungarian collaboration, the other was German, the third was Dutch, and the 4th was British. And they got the first train, the Czech-Hungarian one, brought it to Prague, and had as many children as they could for former children in 2009. Thank you. And had them come to Prague and travel to London the way they had exactly 70 years ago, whenever it was. So this was the 70th, 2009, 1939. And this was the train. Everybody was, this was, in London, in Britain, it came out of Harwich, which is their port, the eastern port. I'll show it. There it is. Its name was Tornado, somewhere. It says that. You can see it says Winton train. And it went from this isn't complete yet. That's it. This is for anybody you can't see it very well. That's its number. A real steam train. And that's here, the face of the train is worth seeing, because that's me standing there. These are roses, and they put those roses, this wreath of roses up there for the 250 children who didn't make it, and for the remaining 1.5 million children who didn't make it from the war. And with this thing, we traveled to London, and this is the completely packed platform. This was the same platform where we arrived. This is my foster brother and his wife, but somewhere, there's Mr. Winton, 100 years old, and he said, "Thank you for coming. This is much more confusing than it was 70 years ago. And secondly, please don't wait 70 years till we meet again." He was wonderful. He spoke loudly. That's where it was anyway. That's how it was. And he just died. There he is. Just died a year ago. And then, and this is in London at the railway station, where they built, the British population built, thank you, a thank you monument reminding of the children. That's a plate that's there, gratitude to the people for saving the lives of 10,000, because there had been other children from Germany and Austria before Mr. Winton even came to the Czech Republic. So I was one of 669, but there were a total of almost 10,000 who came from other countries in Europe. So felt where they came from, and I think so. They have suitcases, and it really is a very realistic graph. It's a wonderful monument, and these are the creators, that's it. So it's 10:15. If you have questions, please ask, and thank you for listening.